Long before Roman legions ever marched into the forests of the north, the world of Rome and the peoples beyond its borders had already begun to influence one another. Early encounters, like the Gallic sack of Rome, left a deep impression on Roman memory, reinforcing the image of fierce northern warriors. Yet for centuries, Rome's main struggles were not with these tribes, but with powerful Mediterranean rivals. Only after defeating kings, empires, and even pirates did Rome finally turn its full attention northward. When Julius Caesar entered Gaul, the outcome of his campaign was almost inevitable from a military perspective. But what followed was far more complex than simple conquest. Roman expansion was driven not only by strategy, but also by ambition and greed. Wealth flowed into Rome, and its elite competed fiercely for power and influence. Instead of ruling every conquered land directly, Rome often preferred a more efficient approach. Local rulers were left in place as long as they remained loyal, paid tribute, and maintained order. This system allowed Rome to extend its influence without overstretching its resources. At the same time, the peoples of Gaul and nearby regions were already changing. Trade with Rome had introduced new goods, new ideas, and new social structures. In many areas, powerful families competed for dominance, and Roman support could tip the balance in their favour. By the time Caesar arrived, the Celtic world was already partly shaped by Roman influence. Trade networks connected distant regions, and certain settlements had grown into important economic centres. Yet these societies lacked strong political unity. Constant rivalries made them vulnerable, and Roman involvement often appeared as an opportunity rather than a threat. At first, Rome offered titles, gifts, and alliances. But Caesar brought something new: military force. His campaign shattered the fragile balance among the tribes, transforming local conflicts into a wider struggle shaped by Roman power. Despite this, Rome did not immediately impose its culture or institutions on conquered lands. Instead, it built upon existing systems. Local elites were integrated into Roman structures, and over time, a blending of cultures took place. In Gaul, this fusion proved remarkably successful. Roman cities rose on Celtic foundations, and the upper classes found new opportunities within the empire. Yet beneath the surface, older traditions remained alive, creating a unique cultural mixture rather than a complete transformation. As Rome expanded, it also tried to define and categorize the peoples it encountered. Caesar described Gaul as divided into distinct groups and drew a clear line between the Celts and the Germans. In his view, the Germans represented a harsher, more primitive world, standing in contrast to the more civilized societies closer to Rome. This way of thinking shaped Roman attitudes for generations. But reality was far less clear-cut. Archaeological evidence shows strong similarities across the Rhine, suggesting that cultural boundaries were fluid rather than fixed. Rome's northern frontier did not emerge from a single grand plan. It developed gradually, shaped by war, politics, and circumstance. After early advances, Roman expansion slowed. Campaigns continued, but the idea of turning all of Germania into a province was never fully realized. Instead, a frontier zone formed along the Rhine and Danube. This was not a hard boundary, but a region of interaction, trade, and tension. Over time, however, it became more defined, marked by fortifications and military presence. By the 2nd century, this frontier had taken on a life of its own. Roman cities flourished behind it, and their inhabitants no longer saw themselves as living on the edge of the world. They depended on stability, trade, and protection. Emperors began to focus more on defense than expansion. Walls were built, not only to stop enemies, but also to reassure the population. These structures, however, had unintended consequences. they attracted groups from beyond the frontier, encouraging new alliances and larger tribal confederations. Life along the frontier was complex. It was a place of opportunity as well as danger. Trade flourished, and people from both sides interacted daily. Germanic tribes settled near Roman territory, trading goods and even serving in the Roman army. Many adopted aspects of Roman life, while still maintaining their own traditions. Over time, the frontier became less of a dividing line and more of a shared space where cultures blended. Yet this balance was fragile. Roman leaders often viewed the growing presence of barbarian groups with suspicion. At the same time, these groups struggled to understand Rome's contradictions. How could the empire welcome them as traders and soldiers, yet also treat them as enemies? Tensions grew and periods of cooperation were interrupted by violence. Roman armies launched harsh campaigns across the frontier, destroying villages and imposing their authority through force. Despite these conflicts, the relationship between Rome and the northern peoples was never purely hostile. It was a constant exchange of influence, shaped by trade, warfare, and adaptation. Over time, many Germans became deeply integrated into the Roman world, serving in its Banach and even rising to positions of power. On the frontier, identities blurred. A man could be Roman in service and German by birth, living between two worlds. The old warrior at the center of this story lived between two worlds, yet he did not see them as enemies. He could call himself a Frank and a Roman soldier at the same time, without feeling divided. For him, these loyalties did not cancel each other out, because they belonged to different parts of life. To be Frank meant belonging to a family, to a wider network of kin, and to the close bonds of warriors who fought beside one another. To be Roman meant serving a political order, obeying laws, and taking a place within a vast and disciplined imperial system. These identities could overlap. A man could remain rooted in his people while also fighting under Roman command. Among the Germanic peoples, loyalty was personal and intense. It was tied to relatives, to trusted companions, and to the war band that offered honor, protection, and glory. Rome worked differently. Roman loyalty was spread across institutions, ideals, and habits of obedience. For the educated elite, it could mean pride in Roman civilization itself. For ordinary soldiers, it might be as simple as service, discipline, and regular pay. Roman commanders understood very well that tribal ties could complicate military service, so they often moved recruits far from their own homelands. They knew that a man stationed near his village might hesitate in battle or quietly warn his people of an approaching attack. This did happen at times, but even then the goal was often not betrayal in the full sense. Many Germanic recruits did not want Rome destroyed. They wanted peace between the empire and their own communities. Serving Rome did not always require them to hate their own people. This is one of the most important truths about the frontier world. It was not a simple border between two pure and separate civilizations. It was a zone of contact where identities blurred, where customs mixed, and where many men learned to live in both worlds at once. The Germanic soldier in Roman service came from societies that had already been changing for generations. These societies were not frozen in some timeless wilderness. They were developing, adapting, and becoming more complex long before they crossed the imperial frontier in large numbers. Small and shifting tribal groups slowly gave way to stronger regional alliances. Warrior elites rose to prominence. Warbands became more organized. Confederations emerged, and with them came more permanent leadership, sharper social divisions, and a growing sense of territory and political order. This pattern can be seen across many different peoples. The Alemanni, the Quadi, the Gepids, the Goths, and the Lombards all moved through similar stages of development. Their societies became more layered and more structured over time. Craftsmanship improved. Ideas about land and authority became more defined. Art changed. Religion evolved. Every part of life was touched by this movement toward greater complexity. Rome was not the only force behind these transformations, but it was often the strongest one, especially when it came to institutions, rank, and social hierarchy. Contact with the empire gave Germanic leaders new models of power. It showed them how status could be displayed, how authority could be formalized, and how a ruling elite might distinguish itself from the mass of ordinary people. There were other influences as well. The peoples of the steppe, especially those connected to the regions north of the Black Sea and deeper into Central Asia, also left a mark on the Germanic world. In some areas, especially among early Eastern Gothic groups, artistic styles and cultural impulses from the steppe became visible. But these influences, whether Roman or steppe, never erased the older foundations of Germanic life. Family structures remained strong. Oral tradition remained powerful. Religious habits and inherited customs survived even as the outside world pressed in. The old ways did not vanish overnight. Because of this, full cultural merger never happened. Germanic societies changed, but they did not lose themselves completely. Still, the pull of Rome was especially strong. The empire represented wealth, order, prestige, and technical skill on a scale that no Germanic society could match. The frontier itself became a school of transformation. Long before Germanic peoples entered Roman provinces as settlers or conquerors, they had already been learning from life along the border. The attraction of that world was difficult to resist. By the later 4th century, many Germanic communities near the Rhine were living very close to the frontier. Some settled within easy reach of Roman forts and towns. People moved constantly across this contact zone. Trade, labour, military service, and personal relationships bound both sides together. These frontier communities were not Roman cities, but they were no longer the loosely mobile villages that had once characterised much of the Germanic world farther east. Settlement became more fixed. Villages lasted longer. Regional alliances tied them together. Powerful noble families gained influence. As these societies settled more permanently, their ideas about land also became sharper. Some groups began to define their territories clearly, even marking boundaries with stones. This was not just a practical change, it reflected a broader shift in mentality. A people that once moved more freely across landscapes was beginning to think in terms of controlled space, political zones, and defended regions. Among the Goths and others, words developed for different levels of landholding and territory. Law would eventually follow, dealing with possession, inheritance, and dispute. But these legal ideas matured only after long exposure to Roman thinking. By the 4th century, everyday life on the frontier was steadily narrowing the distance between Roman and German. Casual contact had already begun this process, but military recruitment pushed it further. Germanic men served in frontier units, lived beside Romanized populations, married locally, and absorbed habits that would have seemed foreign to their ancestors. One visible sign of this cultural blending appeared in dress and ornament. On both sides of the frontier, soldiers and their families adopted decorative styles that belonged to neither pure Roman nor pure Germanic tradition. Personal items such as brooches and belt fittings became more elaborate, shaped with great skill to catch the light and sparkle. What had once been ordinary military equipment became objects of beauty. These styles spread across the frontier region from the Black Sea to Britain. They were especially popular in military zones, where Roman and Germanic lives overlapped most closely. This was more than fashion. It was evidence that the frontier was becoming a civilization of its own. Families were intermarrying. Shared tastes were forming. Even language was changing. In these mixed communities, a new way of speaking was likely emerging from the blending of everyday Latin with Germanic dialects. Pure Latin survived in official command and administration, but daily speech on the frontier must often have sounded different, shaped by both traditions at once. War interrupted this process more than once, especially during the brutal struggles of the late 4th century. But it could not stop it. The social reality of the frontier kept drawing people together. By the beginning of the 5th century, this long process of mixing had reached a new stage in parts of the Upper Rhine and Danube. Archaeologists can see it clearly in burial customs. Graves were arranged in neat rows, aligned in a regular pattern, and filled with a combination of objects that reveal a blended society. Weapons and ornaments reflected Germanic customs. Stone tombs and sarcophagus traditions pointed back to Roman influence. Clothing, jewellery, and grave goods all showed subtle fusion. These cemeteries belonged to a people shaped by both worlds. The pattern did not arise by chance. It appeared in places where Germans had settled after long contact with Roman frontier society, among military recruits, tenant farmers, settled outsiders, and the fading remains of Roman rural culture. As Roman villa life retreated in northern regions, this new mixed civilization spread more widely. In some southern areas, Roman urban traditions remained stronger and helped shape later Western Europe in different ways. But in the north, the row grave pattern became one of the clearest signs of a new cultural landscape. Christianity strengthened some of these burial habits over time, especially the alignment of graves, though it also discouraged the old custom of burying the dead with many personal possessions. Even so, the larger story remained the same. Where Roman and Germanic elements were brought together over generations, a new society emerged. This process did not happen everywhere in the same way. In the calmer northern zones, blending could proceed more steadily. In the Danube regions and farther southeast, repeated invasions and political upheaval created a far more violent environment. Eastern Germanic peoples, such as the Gepids, Visigoths, and Ostrogoths, faced different pressures. They had to solve urgent problems of settlement, power, and defence in lands shaken by war. In such conditions, compromise was harder, and older distinctions could remain stronger for longer. Some groups preserved clearer boundaries between Roman and Germanic elements, at least in theory. Others blended more slowly. The Ostrogoths, for example, followed their own path and did not simply repeat the development seen farther west. Where Roman authority had completely broken down, violence could be extreme. In some regions, both Roman society and the invading peoples were so fragmented that almost no stable order existed at first. Raiding, local warfare, fear and uncertainty defined daily life. But even in harsher regions, once the first storm of conquest had passed, rulers had to find practical ways to govern. That necessity pushed barbarians and Romans toward cooperation. In some kingdoms, settlement was organized through arrangements that paired newcomers with Roman landowners or communities. This system did not erase cultural difference, but it created a framework in which both sides could begin living side by side. In Italy, southern Gaul and Burgundy, this kind of settlement helped ease the transition from imperial rule to barbarian kingdom. At first, many people were cautious. The gap between Roman and barbarian remained real. Yet time changed attitudes. The first generation hesitated. The next generation adapted more easily. Their children grew up in a world that already felt mixed. The pace and depth of this transformation varied from place to place, depending on several major factors. Cooperation between Roman and barbarian elites mattered enormously. So did religion. A barbarian people that embraced forms of Christianity closer to the Roman majority found integration easier. The survival of Roman officials, military officers, towns, and administrative habits also shaped outcomes. Prestige mattered as well. When barbarian nobles adopted Roman dress, education, manners, and symbols of authority, they signalled that Roman civilization was not just something to conquer, but something to inherit. Not every Germanic leader reacted in the same way. Some held tightly to old customs. Others, especially among the nobility, saw Roman culture as a source of immense advantage. These men adopted Roman styles quickly. They wore Roman clothes, used Roman symbols of office, sought Roman learning, and at times married into Roman families. This was not simply imitation. It was also a political strategy. These leaders were trying to govern mixed populations in lands that had once belonged to a sophisticated empire. They needed tools equal to that challenge. Roman models offered such tools. Some Gothic rulers seem to have recognized this very early. They understood that there was more to gain from using Roman institutions than from trying to build an entirely separate barbarian state from scratch. Yet this path was dangerous. A ruler who leaned too heavily toward Rome could alienate his own followers. Many warriors still understood kingship primarily in terms of war, plunder, and leadership in battle. Once conquest succeeded, the confederations that had held together on campaign often began to loosen. The enemy had been defeated. The shared danger had faded. Why then obey a strong king in peacetime? Many war leaders had only recently risen to prominence. They now had to redefine what kingship meant in a settled land filled with cities, landlords, merchants, churches, and old Roman expectations. That required a new kind of rule, one that many were unprepared for. Again and again, barbarian rulers found themselves trying to hold together coalitions that had been built for war, not government. This tension can be seen clearly in the early Frankish world. A king like Childeric could be buried with the splendour of royalty, yet much of his appearance and symbolism resembled that of a late Roman military commander. He was both barbarian ruler and heir to Roman forms. That combination was not unusual. In northern Gaul, even the surviving Roman forces had become deeply mixed in character. Roman armies there contained many men of Germanic background, while Frankish leaders often looked strikingly Roman in dress and military style. When Clovis defeated the last major Roman military power in Gaul, he did more than win a battle. He ended organised Roman resistance in the region and opened the way for a new political order. Yet even then, Frankish kings did not simply abandon Roman methods. They blended family-based leadership and warrior loyalty with Roman administrative habits, legal ideas, and the support of the church. That blending never became easy or complete. Frankish politics remained shaped by family ties, rivalries, and the belief that the ruling dynasty itself was the true centre of legitimacy. Roman ideas of centralised state power did not erase older habits of kinship and personal following. The result was a kingdom pulled between two traditions, just like so much of early medieval Europe. This was one of the great legacies of the frontier world. It had taught Germanic peoples how to borrow from Rome without becoming Roman in the old imperial sense. It had also forced Roman traditions to survive in new hands and under new masters. There was always urgency in these early barbarian courts. Decisions had to be made quickly. Land had to be distributed. Warriors had to be settled. Roman landowners demanded justice. Cities wanted protection. Trade had to continue. Taxes or their equivalents had to be gathered. Churches expected favour. Noble followers demanded rewards. All of this happened in kingdoms that were still unstable and could fall apart almost as quickly as they had formed. Many ordinary Germanic settlers cared less about the glory of Roman towns than about access to land suited to farming. Many nobles, however, found value in the towns themselves, where prestige, comfort, literacy, and old institutions still survived. Some even arranged Roman educations for their children. What had once been a world of hostages and suspicion slowly became a world in which barbarian elites could be received as guests and partners. Before the invasions of the 5th century, prolonged contact with Rome had already made Germanic societies more cohesive in political and military terms. But these peoples were still confederations, rather than fixed nations in the later sense. Much in their social structure remained flexible, open to change, and receptive to Roman influence. Even after conquering Roman lands, they continued to build upon Roman foundations because Roman civilization had already become part of their own historical experience. They had borrowed from it for so long that they could not simply reject it. Their deepest hostility had usually been directed not at Roman culture as a whole, but at the Roman army and the state machinery that had used force against them. Once those institutions weakened or disappeared, much of that hatred faded. What remained was the possibility of inheritance. This is why no purely separate Germanic world could simply rise from the ashes of empire. The idea of a completely independent Germania had always been more of a Roman mental image than a lasting historical reality. By the time barbarian kingdoms emerged, their rulers were already products of centuries of contact, conflict, and exchange. They could not turn back time. They could only move forward through adaptation. Even those who dreamed of preserving both Roman order and Germanic vitality faced enormous obstacles. Theodoric the Great would later become the most famous example of this ambition. He tried to build a kingdom in which Roman and Goth could live side by side, each preserving its strengths, while contributing to a stable political order. It was an extraordinary vision, and for a time it seemed possible. The story of the Ostrogoths cannot be separated from their long and complex relationship with Rome. From their earliest beginnings to their final disappearance as a political force, their fate was shaped by the pull and pressure of the Roman world. Yet the deeper we look into their origins, the more uncertain everything becomes. Even the name Ostrogoth is not ancient in the way we might expect. It only appeared relatively late, after generations of change had already transformed the people it was meant to describe. As we move further back in time, the clear outlines of history begin to dissolve. What once seemed solid becomes uncertain, and what we thought we knew slips into shadow. If we judge history only by written records of wars and politics, then the Goths barely exist before the 3rd century. But they were there, living far beyond the gaze of Roman writers. By the end of the 1st century, groups known as Goths were already present somewhere in northeastern Europe. They lived in small communities, scattered across wide landscapes, far from cities, far from empire, and far from any centralized power. Their world was shaped by the rhythms of nature. They moved with the seasons, settled for a time, and then moved again. Their communities were small, often no more than a few hundred people, and they likely gathered in larger numbers only for rituals or shared religious moments. Even in this early stage, change was already underway. Archaeology reveals patterns that stretch across vast regions from the Baltic down toward the Black Sea. These patterns shift and evolve over time, suggesting not a static world but one slowly moving, adapting, and developing. The direction of this change seems to point southeast, toward lands closer to the Roman frontier. This was not a sudden migration, but a gradual drift, shaped by many small decisions made over generations. The lands east of the Elbe were influenced by 2 distant but powerful worlds. To the north lay Scandinavia, with cultures that shared similar ways of life, similar diets, and likely similar beliefs. To the south lay the Roman Empire, a completely different world, rich, organized, and technologically advanced. Even far from its borders, Roman influence could still be felt. Roman goods travelled along rivers and trade routes, reaching communities that had never seen a Roman soldier. Pottery, tools, and other objects carried with them not just practical value, but ideas and new possibilities. Yet the people of these northern lands were not simply passive recipients of influence. Their societies were built on strong family ties. Kinship defined identity. Alliances were formed through marriage, shared obligations, and the exchange of gifts. Leadership was personal, not institutional. A leader gained followers not through laws or offices, but through generosity, success in war, and the ability to inspire loyalty. Gift-giving played a crucial role. It created bonds that extended beyond family, linking warriors and leaders into networks of mutual obligation. These bonds could grow, but they also required constant renewal. Power had to be maintained through action, not inherited through stable institutions. As groups moved southward, these systems began to evolve. Contact with other communities and eventually with the Roman world increased the importance of organized warbands. Warfare became more frequent and leadership became more specialized. Some men rose above others, not just within their families but across wider regions. The foundations of a new kind of society were being laid, one that was more hierarchical and more structured than before. The Roman frontier played a decisive role in this transformation. It acted like a powerful magnet, drawing people toward it. Not everyone moved, and not all at once. Some stayed behind, maintaining older ways of life. Others moved slowly, family by family, generation by generation. They were not driven by dreams of gold or conquest, but by simpler needs. Food, land, opportunity, and perhaps the chance to rise in status all played a part. For ambitious leaders, the frontier offered something new. The possibility of gaining prestige in a world where power could be expanded beyond the limits of traditional kinship. By the 2nd century, this movement was becoming more noticeable. Communities were shifting. Some areas began to decline as their most active members moved away. Others, closer to the frontier, grew more dynamic. Roman influence became stronger the further south one went. Yet these migrants did not arrive as a unified people. They came as scattered groups, often with little connection to one another. They had to adapt to new environments, new neighbours, and new challenges. When these groups reached the lands north of the Black Sea, they encountered societies that were more developed in certain ways. Trade networks already existed. Cities connected to the wider Mediterranean world offered goods, ideas, and opportunities. Greek and Roman influences were present through trade centres and coastal settlements. These interactions accelerated the transformation of the newcomers. They adopted new techniques, new styles, and new forms of organisation. They learned quickly, blending what they found with what they already knew. Out of this mixing of cultures emerged a complex and diverse world. It was not dominated by a single people at first. Instead, many groups contributed to a shared material culture, shaped by trade, adaptation, and necessity. Over time, however, the Goths began to stand out. They grew in strength, absorbing or dominating neighbouring groups. Their identity became clearer, not because they were unchanged, but because they had successfully integrated many different influences into a new form of society. As they settled and grew more powerful, they also faced new challenges. Other Germanic groups were already present in these regions, and competition was inevitable. Conflicts broke out, alliances shifted, and rivalries intensified. At the same time, the Roman Empire itself was entering a period of instability. Internal crises weakened its ability to control the frontier. This created an opportunity for the Goths and their allies. Raids began, first small and disorganized, then larger and more ambitious. These early incursions were not part of a grand strategy. They were driven by immediate needs: food, wealth, and survival. Groups moved quickly, taking what they could and avoiding strong resistance where possible. Roman armies, stretched thin, struggled to respond effectively. At times, they achieved victories, but they could not maintain consistent control. The frontier became a zone of constant tension, where power shifted rapidly and unpredictably. By the middle of the 3rd century, something new had emerged. The Goths were no longer just one group among many. They had become the dominant force in a loose coalition of peoples operating along the lower Danube. This was not a unified state, but it was a step toward greater coordination. Leaders began to stand out, commanding larger groups and gaining reputations that would echo in later traditions. Still, these figures were not kings in the later sense. They were war leaders, rising through success and fading when fortune turned against them. The conflicts with Rome intensified. Raids reached deeper into imperial territory, even crossing into Asia Minor. Cities were attacked, trade disrupted, and entire regions thrown into chaos. Yet even in this violence, patterns of interaction continued. Some barbarians entered the empire not as enemies, but as settlers or soldiers. Rome adapted by recruiting them, settling them, and using them to reinforce its own strength. The relationship remained complex, never purely hostile, never entirely peaceful. Over time, the Goths began to settle more permanently. New regional identities appeared. Groups became associated with specific territories, no longer constantly on the move. Among these were the Tervingi and the Grothingi. These names reflected not just people, but landscapes and ways of life. Forest regions, open plains, and river valleys all shaped the societies that occupied them. This was a crucial step. It marked the transition from migration to settlement, from fluid identity to something more stable. At the same time, leadership structures continued to evolve. Dukes commanded warbands, but no single ruler controlled all Goths. Authority remained fragmented, shared among competing leaders. This made diplomacy with Rome difficult. Agreements could be made, but they were often temporary, tied to individuals rather than institutions. Still, both sides tried to manage the relationship through alliances, payments, and occasional force. In the 4th century, a new phase began. Roman power was reorganizing under strong emperors, and the Goths were also becoming more structured. Conflicts between them grew larger and more decisive. Roman campaigns pushed deep into Gothic territory, forcing them to unite in response. For the first time, a broader leadership role emerged among the Goths, though it remained temporary and tied to specific crises. Out of this environment came figures who would later be remembered as great rulers. Among them was Ermanaric, a leader whose reputation would grow into legend. He did not rule a simple tribe, but a vast and diverse alliance. His authority rested on a combination of military strength, strategic marriages, and the ability to manage different groups within a fragile coalition. He brought together Goths, Sarmatians, and others under a single framework, creating one of the most powerful confederations in the region. Yet this achievement was always unstable. The alliance depended on constant effort, constant negotiation, and constant demonstration of strength. It could expand rapidly, but it could also break apart just as quickly. When new threats appeared, especially from the east, the limits of this system became clear. The arrival of the Huns would soon test everything the Goths had built. By this point, after generations of movement, conflict, and adaptation, the Goths had become something new. They were no longer scattered communities drifting through forests and plains. They were a people shaped by contact with Rome, by competition with their neighbours, and by the demands of survival in a changing world. They had learned to organise, to lead, and to fight on a larger scale. They had also learned to adapt, to absorb, and to transform. By the time the remnants of the Ostrogothic Confederation reached the Danube, it was already too late. The great wave of refugees, driven westward by the terrifying advance of the Huns, had overwhelmed everything in its path. When Roman commanders along the river finally grasped the scale of what was happening, they acted quickly. The crossings were blocked. Ships patrolled the river. Entry into the empire was no longer a simple request. It had become a desperate gamble. Among those stranded were the followers of Alathius and Saphrax, leading what remained of a once powerful people. They sent envoys to the Roman authorities asking for permission to cross and settle within imperial lands. But the answer was no. The Romans had seen too much chaos already. They were trying to control the flow, not open the gates further. Only selected groups were allowed through, and even they were disarmed, separated and scattered across different regions to prevent any unified uprising. This system of controlled settlement had worked before. For decades, Rome had managed its frontiers not only with armies, but with careful planning. Barbarian groups could be absorbed, turned into soldiers, farmers, or labourers, strengthening the empire while easing pressure beyond the borders. But now, the situation was spiralling out of control. Too many people were arriving at once. Too much fear, hunger, and desperation had built up. Conditions on both sides of the Danube were catastrophic. Gothic families had been wandering for months, searching for food. Supplies were gone, starvation spread. Some parents, unable to feed their children, sold them into slavery just to keep them alive. On the Roman side, the situation was hardly better. Officials struggled to cope with the sudden human flood. Fear mixed with exhaustion, and discipline began to break down. The Roman response grew harsher. In earlier years, emperors had already tried to weaken the Germanic world beyond the frontier. Raids had been launched, leaders assassinated, entire communities destabilized. At one point, a bounty had even been placed on barbarian heads. In such chaos, it became impossible to distinguish friend from enemy. Even allies may have been slaughtered by mistake. Now, as desperate survivors gathered along the river, these same people were asking for protection from the very power that had once hunted them. The tension soon exploded. Roman officers attempted to regain control by eliminating key Gothic leaders. A banquet was arranged, but it was a trap. Many were killed, including important figures who might have kept order among their people. Others, more cautious, escaped. One of them, Fritigern, would soon rally his followers and turn desperation into open war. Once the fighting began, everything changed. Groups that had been waiting on the northern bank seized their chance. Alathius and Saphrax led their warriors across the Danube, fully armed and ready for battle. They joined the growing Gothic force that now challenged Rome directly. What had begun as a refugee crisis turned into a full-scale uprising. The confrontation reached its peak at Adrianople. Roman forces, confident in their strength, pressed forward against the Gothic camp. But at a critical moment, the cavalry of Alathius and Saphrax struck from behind. In the chaos and dust of battle, Roman formations collapsed. Soldiers pressed against each other, unable to maneuver. Surrounded and overwhelmed, they were destroyed. The defeat was catastrophic. It marked one of the most devastating losses in Roman military history. In the aftermath, the Gothic groups spread across the Balkans. Some were eventually settled within imperial lands, particularly in regions like Pannonia, but their presence remained unstable. They caused damage, clashed with local populations, and were often redistributed by Roman authorities in an attempt to maintain order. Over time, many were absorbed into the Roman army, losing their distinct identity in the process. Yet traces of their presence remained. Archaeological discoveries reveal glimpses of their world. Rich ornaments, gold medallions, and intricate jewellery that speak of status and power. Some of these objects imitate Roman styles. while others reflect a blending of cultures. They show a society in transition, shaped by contact with Rome, but still rooted in its own traditions. By the late 4th century, the name Ostrogoth began to appear more clearly. These were no longer scattered groups, but a people beginning to define themselves within the shifting landscape of the time. Many, however, remained tied to a new and powerful force: the Huns. Under Hunnic domination, the Ostrogoths entered another phase of their transformation. The Huns built a vast and flexible empire, not through rigid administration, but through personal loyalty and alliances. At the top stood their rulers, surrounded by a network of subordinate leaders from different peoples. Among them were Gothic nobles, who held positions of authority while remaining subject to Hunnic power. This system created a new kind of hierarchy. Some Goths rose to high status, serving as commanders and administrators within the Hunnic structure. They displayed their rank through rich clothing, weapons, and symbols of authority. Others remained in small settlements, living much as they had before, though influenced by the changing world around them. The gap between elite and commoner widened sharply during this period. Despite their position, life under the Huns was not easy. Memories of subjugation ran deep. The Ostrogoths had little freedom to act independently. Their leaders were expected to obey, their warriors to fight in Hunnic campaigns. Yet within this system, they learned valuable lessons. They observed new forms of power, new ways of organizing large and diverse groups, and new methods of warfare. When the Hunnic Empire finally collapsed, everything changed again. Freed from domination, the Ostrogoths had to rebuild their identity. But they did not emerge as a single unified people. Some followed the leadership of the Amali family, while others pursued their own paths. Rivalries continued, alliances shifted, and the struggle for power resumed. In the years that followed, the Ostrogoths moved into the Balkans, settling in regions offered by the Roman Empire. This was not a peaceful process. Their presence created tension with other Gothic groups already living there. Competition for land, resources, and imperial favour led to constant conflict. At times, the Goths fought Rome. At other times, they served it. Two rival leaders came to represent these divisions. Both claimed authority over the Gothic people, and both sought recognition from the empire. Their rivalry nearly led to a civil war among the Goths themselves. In one dramatic moment, their armies faced each other, ready to fight. But the warriors refused. They had endured too much suffering. They would not destroy each other for the sake of their leaders' ambitions. This moment reveals something essential about the Gothic world. Beneath the struggles of kings and generals, ordinary people were driven by more immediate concerns: food, land, survival. They had crossed rivers, lost families, and fought countless battles. What they wanted now was stability. The story of the Ostrogoths in this period is not just one of war and conquest. It is a story of movement, adaptation, and survival. From small wandering communities in the north, they had become a major force in the late Roman world. They had faced Rome, served it, and fought against it. They had lived under the shadow of the Huns and emerged transformed. Theodoric had kept his word to the empire, yet in return he was left humiliated. His failure was not his own, it was the result of imperial politics, and he knew it. Returning to the lands near Pella was no longer an option. His people were exhausted, hungry, and restless. He demanded a new settlement, a fresh start. But the Emperor Zeno had already shifted his priorities. Instead of supporting Theodoric, he began to favour his rival, Theodoric Strabo. At the same time, chaos unfolded in Constantinople. Basiliscus, who had seized power, proved incapable of ruling. His decisions angered allies and enemies alike. Even Strabo, who had once been useful to the regime, grew dissatisfied. Sensing an opportunity, Zeno moved quickly. He rejected Theodoric's demands and instead declared him an enemy. Strabo was offered command and imperial support in exchange for turning against him. Theodoric found himself surrounded by enemies and betrayal. Furious but unable to confront the full might of the empire, he struck back where he could. His forces descended into the Rhodope Mountains, burning villages, seizing livestock, and leaving destruction behind. It was a brief outburst of rage rather than a calculated campaign. Soon, reality set in. He could not fight everyone at once. Survival demanded movement. He led his people westward. As they approached Thessalonica, the situation shifted again. The city had fallen into unrest, its people rejecting imperial control and placing authority in the hands of the bishop. Theodoric negotiated entry, but once his followers arrived, discipline collapsed. Hunger drove them into the countryside. Fields were stripped, supplies seized. Order gave way to necessity. From there, the Ostrogoths moved along the great road that cut through the Balkans. Stobi fell to them, burned and looted. At Heraclea, they were spared destruction only because local authorities provided food. The pattern was clear. Wherever supplies were given, the Goths moved on. Where they were denied, they took what they needed. Eventually, Zeno made another offer. He proposed settlement near Totila, promising gold to sustain them until they could harvest their own crops. But Theodoric refused. He knew those lands. They were poor, unstable, and already scarred by past conflicts. Better lands lay farther west, closer to the coast, and that was where he intended to go. The journey grew more dangerous. The terrain narrowed into mountain passes, perfect for ambushes. A determined enemy could have trapped the entire Gothic migration and starved them out. But the imperial forces withdrew instead of resisting. Towns emptied at the sound of approaching wagons. Only a few places held out, and even they could not stop the advance. Theodoric aimed for the coast. He needed a strong city, a place where his people could rest and gather supplies. He sent a trusted man ahead to Epidaurus, a town he knew well. The plan worked. The inhabitants fled, and the city fell without resistance. But while Theodoric pushed forward, negotiations with the empire resumed. A new settlement was discussed, this time in fertile lands that could sustain his people. Theodoric even offered major concessions. He was willing to provide troops, to fight for the empire, even to support imperial interests in the west. In return, he demanded recognition, authority, and a place within the Roman system. Zeno hesitated. The idea of elevating a powerful Gothic leader into the heart of imperial command was dangerous. Memories of past generals who had dominated emperors were still fresh. Zeno feared replacing one threat with another, and so, just as agreement seemed close, he broke off negotiations. Then came the betrayal. While talks continued, imperial forces struck at the Gothic rear. Theodoric's people, moving slowly with their wagons and families, were caught off guard. Thousands were captured. Supplies were seized or destroyed. Only a desperate escape saved the remnants from complete disaster. Theodoric learned of the attack too late. His army regrouped, but the damage was severe. With movement eastward blocked, the Goths turned northwest, searching for survival wherever they could. Some reached as far as Noricum, raiding towns already weakened by years of instability. The region was collapsing under pressure from multiple forces. Local communities, caught between different warbands, had nowhere to turn. Many fled south toward Italy, abandoning their homes entirely. At the same time, the political situation shifted again. Theodoric's rival Strabo died, removing one of the main obstacles to his leadership. Zeno, now isolated and facing new rebellions, had no choice but to reconsider. He turned back to Theodoric. One by one, remaining Gothic factions fell under his command. Zeno even ordered the elimination of Strabo's son, clearing the path for unity. For the first time, most of the Ostrogoths in the Balkans were under a single leader. An uneasy alliance followed. Theodoric received high titles, recognition, and command over key regions along the Danube. But peace did not last. His people continued to raid, driven by hunger and uncertainty. The Balkans remained unstable, and the empire lacked the strength to fully control the situation. Meanwhile, another threat emerged in the west. Odovacar, the ruler of Italy, began expanding his influence. His growing power worried Zeno. The balance was shifting again, and this time the solution was clear. Send Theodoric west. For Zeno, it was the perfect move. It removed a powerful and unpredictable force from the Balkans, while redirecting it against a rival. For Theodoric, it offered something he had not yet secured: a real homeland. In 488, the decision was made. The Ostrogoths began their long march toward Italy. It was not an easy journey. The land they passed through had already been stripped bare by years of war. Cities could not support such a massive group. Hunger returned, stronger than before. By the time they reached the Danube plains, famine had begun to take its toll. Then came the final obstacle. The Gepids stood in their way, blocking access to vital supplies. The two sides faced each other across a marshy river, exchanging insults. Neither could retreat. For the Goths, this was a fight for survival. The battle lasted until nightfall. At last, Theodoric's warriors broke through. The Gepid wagons, filled with food, were captured. It was enough to keep the migration alive. Through winter and hardship, they pushed forward. By spring, they were descending from the mountains into northern Italy. Before them lay fertile lands, rich cities, and a new future. Behind them lay years of struggle, betrayal, and survival. Ahead waited Odovacar, and the final battle for Italy. After defeating Odovacar near Verona in 489, Theodoric drove his enemy west, toward the region of Como. But victory did not mean comfort. The Ostrogoths were exhausted, short on supplies, and in poor condition themselves. Instead of pressing forward recklessly, they moved south through Milan and settled for a time in Pavia. The city was overwhelmed. Gothic families crowded inside the walls in huge numbers, and entire sections of the urban landscape were torn down so camps could be set up and the walls patched in haste. Romans and Goths were forced to live side by side under extreme pressure, and the result was constant tension. Space was scarce, tempers were short, and daily life became a struggle filled with arguments, suspicion, and disorder. Theodoric had strong reasons for forcing his people into such cramped quarters. He feared a sudden reversal in the war, especially after the betrayal of Tufa, a man who had recently deserted to his side and then returned to Odovacar. Theodoric did not want his army caught in an exposed winter camp, vulnerable to attack and starving for provisions. So he chose safety over comfort and brought everyone within the walls. Yet this decision only intensified the atmosphere of crisis. Complaints poured in from Romans who had suffered theft, violence, and abuse. Furious and under pressure, Theodoric lashed out. He declared that Romans who refused to support him would lose important civil rights, including the right to make wills and the right to sell property. For the Roman population, this threat was terrifying. Most Romans had no interest in passionately defending either side. They saw little benefit in exchanging one ruler for another and preferred neutrality. They expected that if Theodoric won, some kind of settlement would follow, perhaps based on older Roman practices of billeting and land distribution. But his angry threats suggested something far harsher. If Romans could no longer sell property, then any organised settlement would become nearly impossible, and simple confiscation would follow. If they could no longer pass property to heirs, then the Roman social order itself would begin to collapse. Wealth, family continuity, status, and dignity were all tied to land. Without legal control over property, generations of accumulated standing could vanish. The fear was not abstract. Romans understood that if these rights were stripped away, their whole way of life could disappear within a generation. Fortunately, Theodoric was not only a man of rage, he could also listen. Gradually, the Roman community, led above all by Bishop Epiphanius, persuaded him to narrow his punishment to those who had actively supported Odovacar. By that point, such people were relatively few. Theodoric then handed the matter to one of his trusted advisors, Urbicus, so that the decision could be expressed in proper Roman legal language. This moment reveals something important about the nature of Theodoric's rule. He was no longer acting only as a war leader surrounded by a tribal following. He was beginning to shape a regular court, staffed with traditional Roman offices and organized in the style of the late Empire. Men like Urbicus gave formal structure to his authority. Roman law and Roman administrative habits were being drawn into the center of his regime. Once Odovacar was dead and his followers were either absorbed or removed, Theodoric faced one of the hardest tasks of all: how to settle his people in Italy. Later, official language would describe this process as orderly and even harmonious, as if Goths and Romans had happily become neighbours and partners. That polished image hid a far messier reality. The negotiations behind the settlement were tense, difficult, and full of risk. Some later writers made it sound as though the Ostrogoths simply took over the same allotments that had existed under Odovacar. The truth was more complicated. Theodoric did not strip all of Odovacar's followers of their position. Many seem to have been absorbed into the new Gothic order and tied directly to him through acts of loyalty and ceremony. But committed opponents were excluded, and the entire structure had to be rebuilt with great care. The system of settlement could not work through a crude slicing up of estates. On paper, dividing land into thirds might sound straightforward, but in reality, great estates were complex economic organisms. They depended on a balance of arable land, pasture, woodland, buildings, labourers, slaves, and tenant workers. A simple division could destroy the productivity of the whole estate. Neither Romans nor Goths wanted that. The Gothic nobles needed revenue to support their households, warriors, and dependents. The Roman landowners wanted to preserve as much value as possible. In many cases, the only workable solution was some mixture of sale, shared income, and negotiated adjustment. The settlement was not just about land in the abstract. It was about preserving economic function while transferring power. Theodoric also faced another problem. He could not scatter his people evenly across all of Italy. If he did, the Ostrogoths would lose their cohesion, and their loyalty to the Amali ruling line might weaken. So the settlement was concentrated in key regions. Major clusters formed around Pavia, around Ravenna, and in Picenum. Garrisons were placed in important towns across Italy and along the northern and northeastern frontiers. Small military units were also stationed on major roads. Later, the same pattern extended into Provence, when political conditions there demanded stabilization. Wherever the Goths settled in larger numbers, many returned to agriculture. In order for that to happen without destroying production, there must have been extensive buying, selling, and rearranging of property. Roman senators tried to save what they could, sometimes by converting land into cash. Gothic nobles tried to consolidate holdings that would actually sustain their households and followers. Labour was central to everything. Land without workers had limited value. The old villa economy depended on coordinated labour and on access to many kinds of terrain and resources. The Gothic elite did not want to turn themselves back into simple farmers. They needed productive estates that could yield dependable income. In some regions, especially in the north around Pavia and in the Po Valley, Gothic shares may have been broken down into smaller family farm units. Even then, the larger military following of a nobleman still had to be supported, whether through land, income, or rank-based distributions. The settlement, therefore, involved not only the transfer of property, but the reshaping of an entire social and economic order. Unsurprisingly, the courts were soon flooded with disputes. Settlement claims, complaints over pairings between Roman owners and Gothic recipients, and arguments over what had been assigned to whom dragged on for years. Influential Romans used every connection they had to soften the results or overturn decisions. Yet, Theodoric was usually reluctant to reverse completed grants, especially when powerful Gothic nobles were involved. He seems to have feared the anger that would come from uprooting them after they had already settled with their dependents. In many cases, instead of removing a Goth from disputed property, he preferred to compensate the Roman claimant with land elsewhere. That solution was hardly ideal, but it avoided direct confrontation with his own elite. At the same time, he did try to restrain the worst abuses. Forced sales, illegal seizures, and exploitation clearly occurred, and not only against Romans. Gothic nobles were greedy for one another's land as well. All of this took place in a country already damaged by war. Italy, especially the Po Valley and the region around Ravenna, had suffered badly during the conflict with Odovacar. Campaigns, blockades, and military demands had disrupted transport, undermined local order, and devastated normal life. Even within Theodoric's own alliance system, violence broke out. Some groups allied with the Ostrogoths looted cities despite earlier agreements. War was followed by disease and famine. The transport network had broken down, and requisitions for the army stripped communities of what little they had left. Pestilence spread among the poor. So many clergy died that churches in some places struggled even to hold regular services. To make matters worse, the Burgundians raided Liguria, carried off captives, and left crops rotting in the fields. Theodoric personally sent an embassy to ransom thousands of prisoners, showing both the scale of the disaster and his awareness of it. Yet life was not equally hard for everyone. Those with wealth, family standing, and access to the centres of power in Ravenna and Rome could still protect themselves better than most. Influence mattered enormously. Even so, the machinery of government was overloaded and painfully slow. Legal cases dragged on for years. Personal letters from the period revealed just how exhausting and inefficient the process could be. Even relatively simple matters such as arranging a lease or transferring rights to a villa could require repeated appeals and intervention from well-placed officials. This was not a clean restoration of order. It was a fragile state trying to govern a country still reeling from conquest, famine, disease, and legal confusion. At the heart of this world stood a Roman aristocracy that had survived the fall of emperors and the rise of barbarian kings. Men such as Faustus and Festus show how much continuity remained beneath the political changes. These were not broken remnants of a dead civilization. They were sophisticated players from old and powerful families, trained in Roman letters, public life, and elite culture. They competed for influence at court, served in high office, defended their interests, and maneuvered constantly against rivals. Theodoric did not immediately try to crush their factional politics. For most of his reign, he let these groups compete so long as they remained loyal to the state and did not threaten his position. He saw no advantage in completely favouring one senatorial bloc over another. This balancing act was part of a larger vision. Theodoric was trying to create a stable Gothic kingdom inside the Roman world without destroying Roman traditions. he worked with old aristocratic families and rising new men alike. He relied on Roman law, Roman offices, Roman language, and Roman administrative habits, while at the same time preserving Gothic military power and ethnic identity. He wanted harmony, not fusion. Goths and Romans were not to become the same people, but they were to live under one political order. This required tremendous skill, and for many years he managed it with remarkable dexterity. He also worked tirelessly for recognition from the Eastern Empire. Like Odovacar before him, he used royal authority in Italy without full formal acknowledgement from Constantinople. He wanted his position clarified and accepted. This effort became entangled with the religious divisions of the age, especially the long schism between Rome and Constantinople. Here, the ambitions of Roman aristocrats, bishops, and imperial officials collided. Some members of the Roman elite looked increasingly toward Constantinople for cultural leadership and political legitimacy. Many admired Greek learning, supported Eastern churchmen, and regarded the imperial capital as the center of civilization. Rome still carried enormous symbolic weight, but culturally and intellectually, the East had a powerful attraction. Theodoric himself tried to elevate Rome again. When he visited the city, he entered with ceremony, met the Pope with outward reverence, addressed the Senate and people, promised to uphold the decrees of earlier emperors, celebrated games, distributed grain, and funded the repair of walls and public buildings. He clearly wanted to present himself not as a destroyer of Roman greatness, but as its guardian. He hoped that Rome, not Constantinople, would again become the emotional and political focus of the Western aristocracy. He supported schools and scholarship and invested in the city's prestige. But this dream had limits. Without an emperor in residence, Rome could not truly recover its old centrality. Theodoric could restore grandeur, but he could not fully restore the world that had once made Rome supreme. Religious conflict made everything more dangerous. The split between rival papal factions in Rome drew in aristocratic families, ecclesiastical interests, and imperial diplomacy. Theodoric at first remained careful and impartial, but eventually he was drawn into the struggle. His intervention solved some immediate problems, yet deepened long-term resentment. Over time, factions within Roman society began to see one another through the lens of their relationship to Gothic rule. A group perceived as friendly to Ravenna emerged almost by accident, not because Theodoric had intentionally built a party of loyalists, but because divisions within Roman society pushed some people toward his court and pushed others away from it. Meanwhile, Theodoric's prestige reached far beyond Italy. Through marriage alliances, he tried to weave together the ruling families of the barbarian kingdoms across the former Western Empire. He married into the Frankish royal house. His sister married the Vandal king. His daughters married into Burgundian and Visigothic royalty. Other female relatives were tied to Thuringian power. These alliances were meant to create a broad political network centered on the Amelie line. In theory, this would extend Theodoric's influence throughout much of Western Europe, and establish his family as the natural leaders of the Germanic world. For a time, this vision seemed brilliant. His son-in-law, Eutharic, an Amali by blood, was elevated and celebrated as the dynastic future. The marriage of Eutharic and Amalasuintha appeared to unite the strongest elements of Gothic kingship and Roman political legitimacy. Their children were expected to secure the future. Around the same time, official celebrations, coinage, and public messages portrayed a kingdom in which Goths and Romans had found a stable and glorious balance. Symbols of Gothic power were set beside images of Rome and Ravenna, presenting the two peoples as distinct but complementary. It was the high point of Theodoric's reign. But beneath the surface, the structure was already cracking. The alliances forged through marriage began to unravel. Deaths, rivalries, assassinations, invasions, and political reversals tore holes in the network. In North Africa, in Thuringia, in Burgundy, and in Spain, the carefully arranged family order failed to produce lasting security. Some relatives died, others were overthrown. In some courts, Amali connections became liabilities rather than strengths. Even where Theodoric's influence remained strong, as in Visigothic Spain, autonomy on the ground made distant control difficult. Men ruling in his name could become almost independent, and local tensions steadily grew. At home, the greatest blow came from a shift in trust. By the early 520s, Theodoric seems to have become deeply alarmed by the growing closeness between prominent Roman aristocrats and Constantinople, especially in matters of religion and high politics. For years, these contacts had existed, without provoking a complete break. But circumstances changed. Pressure on Arians in the east, deaths in Theodoric's own family, and the growing sense that sections of the Roman elite were looking past Ravenna toward imperial authority, all darkened his outlook. The balance he had worked so carefully to preserve began to look fragile, even deceptive. It was in this atmosphere that the fall of Boethius unfolded. Boethius was no ordinary senator. He was one of the greatest intellectual figures of his age, a man devoted to philosophy, translation, and public service. He had translated Greek works into Latin, brought the learning of the East into Roman Italy, and served the state at the highest level. Theodoric had honoured him greatly. Yet when accusations of disloyal communication with the emperor were brought against members of the Roman elite, Boethius stepped forward in defence of a fellow senator. That act tied his fate to the case. Whether he fully understood how much the political climate had changed is doubtful. He seems to have believed he was defending justice, the Senate, and the Catholic cause. But Theodoric now interpreted such networks of correspondence and sympathy in a far darker light. The result was catastrophic. Charges widened. Boethius was condemned, stripped of status, imprisoned, and eventually executed. His father-in-law, Symmachus, later met the same fate. To later generations, these deaths became symbols of the tragic end of a remarkable age. They also reveal how far Theodoric had moved from the cautious ruler who once listened to Roman pleas in Pavia and translated anger into measured law. By the end of his life, fear, suspicion, and bitterness had overcome much of the confidence that had once defined his rule. Even so, it would be too simple to reduce his reign to decline or failure. Theodoric had attempted something extraordinarily difficult. He tried to build a Gothic power inside a Roman world without erasing either side. He preserved much of the administrative framework of Italy, worked with the Roman aristocracy, protected the economy where he could, restored cities, managed diplomacy across the former empire, and maintained a long period of relative stability after decades of chaos. But the very thing that made his kingdom impressive also made it fragile. It depended on balance. It required Roman cooperation, Gothic unity, external recognition, economic recovery, and religious calm all at once. Once too many of those supports weakened, the whole structure began to shake. Boethius, writing from his place of exile, tried to make sense of his downfall as if it were the result of misunderstanding and injustice. But the reality was far more complex. His execution was not simply the outcome of a single accusation or a moment of anger. It came from a deeper shift in Theodoric's thinking, shaped by what he himself discovered while examining the political situation around him. What he saw disturbed him more than any one man's words or actions. For years, a network of communication had quietly connected Rome and Constantinople. Members of the Roman elite had long maintained ties with the Eastern Empire, especially in matters of religion and intellectual life. This was nothing new. But now, as Theodoric looked closer, he began to see a pattern. These correspondences revealed a clear hierarchy of loyalty, and in that hierarchy he himself seemed absent. The Roman aristocrats were not openly rebelling, but many of them still looked toward the emperor in Constantinople as the ultimate source of authority. This realization was deeply unsettling, even if it was not entirely surprising. At the same time, another development alarmed him just as much. A group of Romans and Goths, closely connected through personal relationships and shared interests, had begun to form what looked like a political faction centered around his own court. On the surface, this might have seemed like a sign of stability. But for Theodoric, it represented something dangerous. His entire vision for Italy depended on a balance between two distinct peoples, Goths and Romans, each maintaining their identity while cooperating within a single political structure. Now, that boundary was beginning to dissolve. The Gothic nobility, once defined by its warrior traditions and independence, was becoming deeply entangled in Roman aristocratic life. They adopted its habits, its ambitions, and most importantly, its factional politics. Rivalries, jealousy, personal alliances, betrayals, and intrigue, all the features of Roman elite competition, were now pulling the Gothic elite into a world Theodoric had hoped to keep separate. This was not cooperation anymore. It was absorption. The situation made everything more suspicious. The letters exchanged between Rome and Constantinople could no longer be seen as purely religious or intellectual discussions. Goths themselves were now closely tied to Roman aristocrats involved in these networks. And since the Goths followed Arian Christianity, they had little interest in the fine theological debates that animated the Roman world. Their involvement suggested that something more than religion was at stake. Politics and power were clearly intertwined with these exchanges. For Theodoric, this realization was devastating. The foundation of his kingdom had always been the idea that Goths and Romans could live together without losing themselves. Now, he saw that this balance was slipping away. Goths were blending into Roman society, adopting its strengths but also its flaws. Their identity was becoming less distinct. Even their Arian faith, once a clear marker of difference, was no longer a secure boundary. At the same time, Romans had not fully embraced his rule, as he had hoped. Many still looked beyond Italy for legitimacy and leadership. This sense of betrayal weighed heavily on him. He had trusted the Roman elite, worked with them, protected their laws, and preserved their way of life. Yet now he feared that their loyalty was divided. At the same time, he realized that his own people were changing in ways he could not control. The clear separation he had tried to maintain was dissolving into a complex and unpredictable social reality. As these fears grew, Theodoric began to prepare for the worst. He no longer saw Italy as secure. Instead, he imagined the possibility of invasion, most likely from the east. The Byzantine Empire was the only power capable of such an attack. In response, he ordered the construction of a large fleet. Plans were made to build 1,000 lightships, and sailors were to be recruited on a massive scale. Even slaves were promised payment if they took part. These preparations went far beyond normal concerns about trade or communication. They reveal a ruler who now expected war. Yet these efforts came too late. The navy he envisioned never played a significant role in the conflicts that would erupt after his death. The greater tragedy lay not in military failure, but in the collapse of his vision. One by one, the elements that had supported his rule began to fade. The delicate balance between Goth and Roman could no longer be maintained. The unity he had worked to build was giving way to division. Even in his final years, however, the scale of his ambition remained striking. He had tried to achieve something extraordinary, to control the merging of two very different worlds without destroying either one. But in the end, he underestimated both sides. He believed that Roman dissatisfaction with the Eastern Empire would naturally strengthen his position. He did not fully grasp how deeply many Romans remained tied to the idea of imperial unity. At the same time, he underestimated the Gothic nobility. Their desire for power, wealth, and independence had never disappeared. It had only been held in check by his authority. After his death, these tensions became even more visible. His successors struggled to maintain control. Some tried to preserve his vision, others abandoned it in favour of more traditional forms of power. The Gothic elite eventually elevated a new leader in a way that reflected their older traditions, lifting him on a shield in a display of warrior loyalty. This act symbolised a return to their roots, away from the Romanised court culture Theodoric had encouraged. And yet, even then, his influence did not disappear. His successors continued to invoke his memory, to use his symbols, and to present themselves as heirs to his legacy. Coins bore his image and echoed his themes. His idea of a balanced society where Goths and Romans coexisted under a shared political order remained alive as an ideal. Even during the long and destructive wars that followed, this vision did not completely fade. Among the broader population, life continued in quieter ways. Beneath the struggles of kings, nobles, and politicians, ordinary Ostrogoths slowly adapted to their new homeland. They learned to farm Italian land, to live among Roman communities, and to navigate a world shaped by both traditions. Their story is far less visible in the sources, but it is just as important. The stability created at the top of society, even when fragile, allowed them to build new lives. When the Ostrogoths finally settled in Italy, they stepped into a completely new world. For generations, they had lived through movement, war, and uncertainty. Now, for the first time in a long while, they were rooted. This moment shaped everything that followed. Their lives began to revolve around land, farming, and the rhythms of a settled society. Many of them entered directly into the late Roman estate system, not as outsiders looking in, but as participants. They became both producers and consumers within an already complex economy. At the same time, their warrior traditions did not disappear overnight. The old military bonds and loyalties slowly adapted to this new environment, though they never fully vanished. Yet this transformation was not a simple story of assimilation. The Goths did not abandon who they were. Their customs, identity, and traditions remained alive beneath the surface of this new life. For most of them, the experience of stable settlement was unfamiliar, even overwhelming. After years of hardship, the chance to farm, to build homes, and to live in relative security must have felt like a sudden release. Unfortunately, the voices of these ordinary settlers are largely absent from the records. What survives instead are the concerns of the Roman elite. Still, by piecing together scattered evidence, it becomes possible to glimpse how everyday Gothic life began to take shape in Italy. Once land had been divided under the system of shared ownership, the real work began. Estates had to be restored. Years of war had left them fragmented and damaged. The Gothic leadership had already chosen where their people would settle, taking into account not only the land itself, but also roads, supply routes, and military control. Italy had been won through hard fighting, and holding it required careful planning. This meant securing key regions and ensuring that communication lines remained under control. As a result, Gothic settlements were not spread randomly. They were concentrated in specific areas such as Liguria, Picenum, and the Po Valley, especially around Ravenna. Within these regions, the first priority was practical survival. Many estates could not simply be divided into neat portions without destroying their economic value. So land had to be bought, sold, or exchanged. This process of rounding out estates was essential. Gothic nobles often sought to acquire the best land, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. Roman landowners frequently found themselves struggling to defend their rights, appealing to the court in Ravenna for justice. Some, like those in southern Gaul, even found advantage in the new system. A strong Gothic neighbour could offer protection in a dangerous world. In some cases, Gothic buyers paid fair prices for abandoned or damaged lands, creating opportunities for desperate Roman families to recover some of their losses. At the heart of everything stood a simple reality. Roman agriculture depended on balance. A functioning estate needed fields for grain, vineyards, pasture, and woodland. Without this balance, productivity collapsed. This was something every farmer understood, whether Roman or Goth. Legal formulas alone could not guarantee success. Practical necessity forced adaptation. Gothic nobles quickly learned to operate within Roman legal traditions, even using ancient methods of calculation that reached back centuries. These were not abstract ideas, they were tools needed for survival in a complex system. Labour was just as important as land. Fields could not be worked without people. In some regions, estates were divided into smaller farming units, managed by families, but larger estates still required additional workers for seasonal tasks and specialised labour. The transition was difficult. War had disrupted the population. Many workers had been displaced, enslaved, or killed. Landowners, both Roman and Gothic, struggled to rebuild their labour force. They transferred workers from one place to another, shared equipment, and sometimes competed fiercely for control over people, as well as land. For the poorest members of society, these changes were harsh. War, famine, and instability had already pushed them to the edge. Some had been forced to sell their own children into slavery, just to survive. Laws attempted to address these realities, allowing families to buy back their children if they could afford it. But the gap between rich and poor remained deep. Wealthy landowners controlled resources and labour, while the lower classes struggled to maintain even basic security. Even so, efforts were made to restore order. Rules were introduced to prevent abuses, regulate labour, and stabilise agricultural production. Violence remained a serious problem. Armed groups sometimes acted without restraint, seizing property, attacking civilians, and burning homes. Boundary disputes were common, with land markers moved or ignored altogether. Cattle theft became widespread. Authorities attempted to impose control, declaring such actions punishable and emphasizing that law applied equally to Goths and Romans. The message was clear. Stability depended on cooperation and respect for order. Without it, the entire system would collapse. Despite these challenges, the transition to settled life was, in many ways, successful. The Ostrogoths moved from life in temporary camps to permanent homes. The economy began to stabilise. Trade routes reopened. Cities along major roads and the Adriatic coast not only survived, but, in some cases, began to recover. The infrastructure of Roman administration continued to function. Roads were repaired, river transport resumed, and communication networks remained active. Even taxation adapted to the new reality. Gothic settlers initially held tax-free shares of land, but over time, as they acquired more property, they too became part of the tax system. Money played an increasingly important role in this new world. Gothic coinage circulated alongside Roman currency, helping to stabilise trade. Taxes collected by the state were partly redistributed to Gothic soldiers and settlers as annual payments. These payments could make the difference between independence and poverty, especially in years of poor harvests. Markets were open, and goods moved more freely than before. For many Goths, this was a completely different economic experience compared to their past. Life in Italy also brought cultural change. Gothic communities often lived together in specific areas, especially in cities where they built their own churches. These churches became centres of identity, reinforcing their distinct religious and cultural traditions. In places like Ravenna, the Gothic presence was especially strong. The city became a hub where Gothic and Roman influences met. Artisans, craftsmen, and merchants all contributed to a dynamic cultural environment. Gothic metalwork, jewellery, and weapons reached a high level of craftsmanship, spreading beyond Italy into northern Europe. At the top of society, however, tensions continued to grow. Gothic nobles and Roman elites competed for power, wealth, and influence. They adopted each other's habits, including luxury, display, and political manoeuvring. Fine tableware, elegant clothing, and elaborate jewellery became symbols of status. Wealth was essential, not only for comfort, but for maintaining authority and supporting followers. Land remained the most important source of power, and competition for it was constant. For ordinary people, life was simpler, but not necessarily easier. The difference between rich and poor was often less about material possessions and more about social position. A modest household might contain many of the same items as a wealthier one, just fewer and of lower quality. Everyday life revolved around farming, tools, clothing, and basic domestic goods. Former slaves and freedmen lived alongside small landholders, sharing similar conditions. The distinction lay in power, not in objects. Even after the fall of the Ostrogothic kingdom, many of these patterns continued. Gothic names appear in legal documents, showing that people of Gothic origin were still active in society. Some sought justice through Roman legal systems, while others held onto older traditions. The blending of cultures did not end with political defeat. It continued quietly in daily life. At the same time, the Ostrogoths left a wider mark on Europe. Their art, craftsmanship, and political influence extended far beyond Italy. Their objects travelled north, reaching distant regions where they were admired and imitated. Trade networks carried goods across long distances, connecting Italy to the Baltic world. These exchanges were not just economic. They were cultural, spreading styles and ideas across the continent. During the 5th and 6th centuries, most Ostrogoths were not warriors roaming across distant lands anymore. They had become farmers. Their lives were now tied to the soil, to seasons, and to the steady rhythm of agricultural work. Instead of living in temporary huts or rough shelters, many of them moved into abandoned Roman houses, often located near large estates. These buildings, once part of a powerful imperial system, now became homes for a new people learning how to live in a settled world. Archaeology helps bring this transformation to life. In regions like Pannonia, former Roman estates did not simply disappear. Many of them continued to function, though in altered ways. Walled villas became small islands where fragments of Roman life survived. Around them, Germanic groups settled, mixing with the remaining local population. This blending had already begun before the Ostrogoths fully arrived, continuing through the era of Hunnic domination and beyond. The result was not a clean replacement of one culture by another, but a gradual merging shaped by necessity and survival. One site in particular reveals this world in remarkable detail. Located along an important road in northern Pannonia, Fenech Pusta stood as a key centre of settlement and activity. Originally an imperial estate, it remained occupied for centuries. Over time, it was fortified with strong walls and towers, reflecting the defensive needs of a changing world. Excavations uncovered cemeteries both inside and outside the settlement, pointing to a long and complex history. These burial grounds raise important questions about who lived there, how different groups interacted, and how much of the Roman population survived alongside the newcomers. Inside the settlement, a series of graves tells a story of hierarchy and identity. Some burials are rich, filled with gold jewellery, intricate ornaments, and objects that reflect both Roman and Germanic traditions. Others are far simpler. The contrast reveals a society already divided by wealth and status. The richer individuals were buried closer to important religious buildings, suggesting that even in death, social rank mattered. The poorer graves, however, still belonged to members of the same ruling group. They were not remnants of the older Roman population, but rather individuals connected to the new order, perhaps followers or dependents of the elite. The objects found in these graves are especially revealing. They show a blend of influences, combining elements from Roman, Christian, and Germanic traditions. A grave belonging to a wealthy woman, for example, contained gold and silver earrings, a decorative headband, colourful beads, and a ring marked with a Christian symbol. Even simpler graves sometimes included coins or small personal items, hinting at the persistence of older customs. These discoveries suggest that identity in this period was not fixed or uniform. Instead, it was fluid, shaped by contact, adaptation, and shared experience. Scientific studies of the remains add another layer to the story. By analysing bones from various sites, researchers have been able to compare populations and identify patterns. These findings indicate that the people buried at Fenecpusta were neither Lombards nor Avars, but something more complex. The material culture and burial practices point toward a strong Ostrogothic presence, yet not a purely uniform one. The community appears to have been mixed, incorporating different Germanic groups as well as elements of the surviving Roman population. This reflects a broader reality. Ostrogothic rule was not based on a single ethnic identity, but on a network of alliances and shared interests. Even in Italy itself, the Ostrogoths were not alone. Their society included a range of other groups who had travelled with them or joined them over time. Among these were Rugians, Gepids, and even remnants of Hunnic peoples. Each group retained aspects of its own traditions, clothing, and identity. These communities existed within the larger framework of Ostrogothic power, creating a layered society where cultural boundaries were never entirely clear. Despite past rivalries, these groups shared similar ways of life. They farmed, raised animals, and followed leaders who maintained authority through both tradition and force. To truly understand this world, it helps to look at objects that carry deeper meaning. One remarkable example is a golden necklace discovered in what is now Romania. This piece is not just jewellery, it is a miniature reflection of daily life, belief, and identity. Hanging from it are dozens of tiny objects, each carefully crafted. There are tools for farming, such as ploughs, sickles, and pruning knives. There are weapons like spears and shields. There are also items representing craftsmanship, including tools for blacksmiths, cobblers, and builders. The necklace tells a story without words. It shows a world where farming, craftsmanship, and survival were central. The presence of vine leaves suggests cycles of life, growth, and renewal. At the same time, symbols of death and journey appear, reminding the wearer of life's fragile nature. A small figure guiding a boat evokes the passage from life to death, a theme found in many cultures. Together, these elements create a powerful image of existence, where work, belief, and the unseen world were deeply connected. Religion among the Ostrogoths is far more difficult to understand. Unlike the structured systems of the Roman world, their earlier beliefs were not clearly defined or recorded. They did not rely on detailed theology or organized doctrine. Instead, their spirituality was immediate and practical. It was tied to nature, to survival, and to the forces that shaped their daily lives. Rituals were not about abstract ideas, but about maintaining balance, ensuring fertility, and securing protection. Even after converting to Christianity, these older beliefs did not disappear. They continued to influence how people understood the world. Among the Goths, religion was not something separate from life. It was woven into it. This is why their conversion to Arian Christianity did not erase their past. Instead, it layered new beliefs onto existing traditions. For many, Christianity became another way to understand the same forces they had always respected. For the ruling elite, however, religion often had a different meaning. It was closely tied to politics. Leaders could use it to strengthen their authority, build alliances, and distinguish themselves from others. Conversion could serve as a strategic decision as much as a spiritual one. By adopting Christianity, especially in its Arian form, Gothic rulers positioned themselves within the wider world of Roman power, while still maintaining their distinct identity. This dual approach is visible in their art and objects. A helmet found in Italy, richly decorated with symbolic scenes, offers a striking example. It combines Christian imagery with older, more traditional motifs. There are vines, animals, and symbols of life and renewal. There are also scenes of hunting, farming, and ritual offering. The cross appears, but it exists alongside imagery that reflects a much older worldview. This blending shows how beliefs were not replaced overnight. Instead, they merged slowly, creating something new. Throughout this period, the Ostrogoths lived in a world of transition. Their society was shaped by movement, adaptation, and constant interaction with others. They were no longer simply outsiders entering Roman territory. They had become part of a larger system, even as they tried to preserve their own identity within it. Their religion reflects this tension. It was neither fully pagan nor fully Christian, but something in between, evolving over generations. The Ostrogoths never fully transformed their way of leadership into a true system of impersonal government. Even after settling in Italy, power was still deeply personal. Authority did not flow naturally from offices, titles, or written laws. Instead, it lived in relationships between a king and his followers, between noble families and their dependents. While Roman-style administration existed on paper and in practice, most Goths still trusted people more than institutions. In Ravenna, the capital, decisions were made through a structured system inherited from the Roman world. Orders were issued, officials carried them out, and a bureaucratic network connected different regions. But for the average Ostrogoth, this system remained distant. What truly mattered was the belief that the king himself would intervene if something went wrong. Justice was expected to come not from a legal process, but from the personal attention of the ruler. Under Theodoric, this belief was strong, built on years of shared struggle and loyalty. This way of thinking shaped how the Goths saw themselves. They did not identify with a state in the abstract sense. The idea of a unified Gothic nation was unclear and never fully defined. It was not tied to a fixed territory or a strict ethnic identity. Instead, it referred to a people connected by shared history, traditions, and leaders. Even as Theodoric tried to build a stable kingdom within the Roman world, this deeper sense of identity remained fluid. Long before they reached Italy, Gothic society had already been shaped by movement and conflict. During the early migrations, new leaders emerged as families and groups made decisions about where to go and how to survive. In these uncertain conditions, power naturally gravitated towards strong individuals, especially war leaders, who could provide protection and success in battle. Over time, these leaders gathered followers, forming bands of warriors who depended on them for wealth and security. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, this process had created a more stratified society. Wealth and status became visible in burial practices and material culture. Roman objects, once limited to certain roles within the empire, spread among Gothic elites as symbols of prestige. These items were not just decorative. They marked belonging, rank, and influence within the warrior groups that dominated society. At the heart of this structure were tightly knit communities often bound by kinship and shared traditions. These groups functioned both as social units and as military organizations. Each had its own leaders, its own customs, and sometimes even its own religious practices. Decisions were often made in councils, but these councils varied. In some cases, powerful nobles led the discussions. In others, elders representing local communities held more influence. Authority was never entirely centralized. This created a constant tension within Gothic society. On one side stood the nobles and their warbands, supported by armed followers and driven by ambition. On the other side were the villagers, whose lives revolved around agriculture, family, and local stability. These two worlds overlapped, but did not always align. Control was often maintained through force or influence, but beneath the surface, resistance remained. It rarely took the form of open rebellion. Instead, it appeared in subtle ways: evasion, negotiation, and quiet defiance. Even when larger confederations formed, unity was fragile. Leaders could gather different groups together for a campaign or a crisis, but maintaining long-term cohesion was difficult. Each leader still had his own followers, and each group retained its independence. This made coordinated action possible only in moments of extreme danger. Otherwise, authority remained divided. As the Ostrogoths moved west and eventually entered Italy, these older patterns did not disappear. Instead, they adapted to new conditions. Theodoric, their most successful ruler, understood that he needed more than personal loyalty. He attempted to build a functioning government, drawing heavily on Roman models. Administrative offices continued to operate, taxes were collected, courts functioned, and infrastructure was maintained. On the surface, it looked like a continuation of the Roman system. But beneath this structure, Gothic tradition still shaped how power worked. Theodoric placed Goths into key positions, often replacing Roman personnel in roles that required trust and loyalty. His court became the centre of both Gothic and Roman administration, blending the two systems. He relied on experienced Roman officials for technical governance, while ensuring that Gothic leaders remained central to military and political authority. This dual system created a delicate balance. Roman institutions provided stability and continuity, while Gothic leadership maintained control over the people. In theory, it was a unified government. In reality, it depended heavily on the personality and authority of the king. Theodoric held everything together through his reputation, his judgment, and his ability to manage both groups. Justice reveals this balance clearly. Roman courts continued to operate, applying established laws and procedures. At the same time, Goths often relied on their own customs and the decisions of their leaders. In disputes between Goths, traditional practices played a major role. In conflicts involving both Goths and Romans, special arrangements were made to ensure fairness. Officials were expected to understand both systems and apply them accordingly. Yet even with these structures in place, the system was far from perfect. Local nobles often abused their power, especially in rural areas. They seized land, pressured weaker individuals, and manipulated legal processes to their advantage. Complaints sometimes reached the king, who could intervene directly. These interventions reinforced the idea that justice ultimately depended on the ruler, not the system itself. In the provinces, governance followed a similar pattern. Regional officials combined administrative, military, and judicial roles. They were responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and overseeing local affairs. In some areas, especially along the frontiers, their authority was even broader. They commanded troops and acted as the king's representatives in regions where central control was weaker. Despite these efforts, the limitations of the system were clear. The king could not be everywhere. His authority depended on the loyalty of local leaders, and those leaders often acted in their own interests. When conflicts arose, they could not always be resolved quickly or fairly. The structure existed, but its effectiveness varied, depending on circumstances and individuals. What emerges from this picture is a society caught between two worlds. On one side was the legacy of Rome, with its complex institutions and legal traditions. On the other was the Gothic way of life, built on personal bonds, loyalty, and local power. Theodoric managed to hold these elements together for a time, creating a relatively stable and prosperous kingdom. But the underlying tension never disappeared. The Ostrogoths never fully embraced the idea of impersonal government. Their system remained rooted in personal relationships and individual authority. As long as a strong ruler stood at the centre, it could function. Without that figure, the balance began to break down. In the Ostrogothic kingdom, one of the more interesting adaptations from the Roman world was the office known as the Defensor Civitatis, a kind of local protector, originally created in the 4th century to defend ordinary people against abuse by imperial officials. This role had faded over time, only to be revived and reshaped. Under the Ostrogoths, it became something both familiar and different. In Italy, the defensor acted as the voice of central authority within towns, especially smaller ones. Alongside the local council, which represented the community itself, the defensor formed the backbone of local government. But this protection was not always gentle. It included setting prices during times of scarcity and even forcing the population to supply the army when needed. The reality of power could be harsh. One recorded example shows just how distorted the role could become. A man assigned as protector for a senator reportedly enforced his authority through violence, even beating the very person he was meant to defend. Such cases reveal the fragile line between protection and oppression. Because the defensor often stood as the only direct link between a town and the distant royal court, the king had to ensure that those holding the position were loyal. Trust mattered more than formal structure. In times of crisis, such as famine, communities would turn to their defensor to seek relief. But the final decision always rested with higher authorities, regional officials and the king's administration. At first glance, the Ostrogothic system might seem highly organized, almost Roman in its structure. Offices existed, chains of command were defined, and laws were applied through formal procedures. But beneath this surface lay a different reality. Most Goths were not used to such rigid systems. Especially among the nobility, there was resistance to outside control. The idea that officials in Ravenna could interfere with local authority felt like an intrusion. To make the system work, the king had to rely not just on institutions, but on trusted individuals, men who could act in his name and enforce his will where written law alone was not enough. Among these figures were the king's personal agents, men who operated beyond the limits of formal offices. Some held the rank of counts and were sent on special missions, handling delicate political or administrative tasks. But even more important were a group known as the Sionis. They were not defined by titles or rank. They were defined by loyalty. These were the king's direct representatives, sent wherever problems arose. When they arrived, they did not simply assist the local administration. They took control, acting with the authority of the king himself. The Sionis were remarkably versatile. One might be sent to gather troops for a campaign, another to oversee tax collection, another to judge a legal dispute, or even to supervise construction projects. They could investigate corruption, organize supplies for armies, or enforce royal decisions in distant regions. Their role was not fixed because the needs of the kingdom were constantly changing. In many ways, they were the living extension of royal power, bridging the gap between the centralized government and the realities of local life. This flexibility was essential. Without it, the system would have collapsed under its own weight. The formal structure alone could not handle the constant tensions within the kingdom. Local nobles often acted independently, sometimes abusing their power, sometimes ignoring royal authority altogether. The Sionis and special envoys allowed the king to respond quickly, stepping in where the system failed. They were the tools that kept the machinery running. During the long and relatively stable reign of Theodoric, this balance held. The Goths slowly began to adapt to institutional life. They started to use courts, follow procedures, and rely on officials. Even members of the nobility turned to legal systems to resolve disputes. Over time, this marked a gradual shift from purely personal authority towards something more structured. It was not a complete transformation, but it was a significant step. However, this fragile system depended heavily on strong leadership. After Theodoric's death, the cracks began to show almost immediately. His successor, the young Athalaric, lacked the authority to control the powerful nobles, or even his own officials. Corruption spread. Royal agents abused their power, extorting taxes and exploiting local populations. Even tax collectors and governors ignored summons from the central court. The system that once functioned under firm leadership began to unravel. Athalaric himself recognized the problem. In his early proclamations, he warned of growing disorder, people abandoning civilized behavior, rejecting laws, and returning to a more violent and chaotic way of life. He condemned land seizures, forced donations, manipulation of legal documents, and widespread abuse of authority. But his words carried little weight. The institutions remained, but the power behind them had weakened. As the kingdom entered a period of instability, leadership became increasingly contested. After Athalaric's death, power struggles intensified. New rulers failed to command the respect of both the Gothic nobility and the Roman population. Some kings tried to imitate Theodoric's image, presenting themselves as guardians of order and cooperation, but they lacked his authority and skill. Meanwhile, royal agents like the Sionis became more reckless, acting with little restraint and often beyond control. Then came the greatest test, the war against the Eastern Roman Empire. This conflict placed enormous pressure on every part of the system. Taxes increased, resources dwindled, and populations suffered from war, famine, and disease. The government struggled to maintain supply lines and support its armies. Over time, even the basic mechanisms of administration began to break down. In this crisis, the balance of power shifted decisively. The monarchy could no longer rely on its institutions. Instead, it depended increasingly on the nobility. These local leaders controlled land, resources, and men. They became essential for raising armies and sustaining resistance. But this reliance came at a cost. The nobles no longer simply advised the king, they began to dominate him. Military leadership became the path to power. Kings were no longer just rulers. They were war leaders chosen in moments of crisis. Some were elevated directly by their followers, in a manner reminiscent of earlier tribal traditions. Authority returned to its roots, personal, immediate, and dependent on loyalty rather than law. As the war dragged on, the system continued to weaken. The economy collapsed under the strain. Tax collection became inconsistent, sometimes replaced by direct confiscation. Infrastructure deteriorated, and supply networks failed. Even the royal treasury was eventually exhausted. Each failure pushed the kingdom further away from the structured government Theodoric had built, and back toward the fragmented, personal power structures of the past. Despite these struggles, the idea of coexistence between Goths and Romans never fully disappeared. Even during the war, there were efforts to maintain unity and preserve elements of the shared system. Coins, ceremonies, and official declarations continued to reflect a vision of partnership. But reality was harsher. The internal divisions, combined with external pressure, proved too much. Theodoric built his kingdom on something far more fragile than laws or institutions. He built it on himself. His power came from his ability to control two very different worlds at once. The Goths, a warrior society proud of its strength, and the Romans, heirs to centuries of administration, law, and political tradition. Instead of forcing these two cultures to merge completely, he kept them distinct but carefully balanced. It was a delicate system, almost like standing on two supports at the same time, one Gothic, one Roman. As long as he stood firm, the whole structure held together. What made this system work was his vision. He believed that peace in Italy could only be achieved if Goths and Romans worked side by side, each contributing what they did best. The Roman senatorial class regained influence under his rule, even more than their counterparts in the Eastern Empire. At the same time, the Gothic nobility kept their identity as warriors, living in their own communities and maintaining their traditions. Over time, some of these Gothic leaders began to move beyond warfare, stepping into administration and even embracing elements of Roman culture. It was not a fusion, but it was cooperation, and for a time, it worked. By the end of his life, this balance had become the normal way of governing. But the system had one critical weakness. It depended entirely on strong leadership. When Theodoric died, that balance quickly began to collapse. His successors simply could not carry the weight he had managed to hold. Athalaric, still young and inexperienced, fell under the influence of the Gothic nobility, who pushed him toward a more traditional warrior upbringing instead of the Roman education his mother had planned. Caught between two worlds, he failed to master either. His decline was rapid, and his early death left the kingdom without a stable centre. His mother, Amalasuintha, tried to hold things together, but she ruled in a society that still valued strength above all else. In search of support, she turned to her cousin Theodahad, a man more interested in philosophy and land than in power and war. She believed she could control him. That miscalculation cost her everything. Her death not only shattered what remained of internal stability, but also gave the Eastern Roman Emperor a perfect excuse to intervene. From that moment on, the kingdom was dragged into a long and devastating war. The conflict was not just between armies, it was a struggle over the future of Italy itself. Some still believed in Theodoric's vision of cooperation between Goths and Romans, but war made that vision harder to sustain. Suffering spread across the land and loyalties became uncertain. People were forced to choose sides not out of belief, but out of survival. Even among the Gothic leadership, unity was fragile. Theodahad himself showed little desire to resist. At one point, he was ready to give up large parts of Italy in exchange for wealth and a quiet life, far from politics. His lack of resolve only made one thing clear: the strength of the kingdom no longer lay in the crown. Real power had shifted elsewhere. That power now rested with the Gothic nobility. These were men shaped by war, leaders of their own followers, and increasingly independent of any king. When they saw weakness, they acted. They fought battles without waiting for orders, defended territories on their own initiative, and in some cases ignored the royal court entirely. In Dalmatia, for example, Gothic commanders launched campaigns while negotiations were still ongoing elsewhere. Authority had become decentralized, and the monarchy could no longer control events as it once had. Despite this fragmentation, the system Theodoric had created did not vanish immediately. In many places, Goths and Romans still cooperated, especially in times of crisis. Cities like Naples showed how strong that connection could be. When threatened, the population, Goths, Romans, and even minority communities, stood together to defend their city. For a brief moment, the old balance reappeared. But such unity was rare and difficult to maintain under the pressure of constant war. The conflict itself dragged on for years, not because either side was overwhelmingly strong, but because neither had the resources to finish it quickly. Cities became the focus of endless sieges, and control of roads and supply lines mattered as much as battlefield victories. Rome, in particular, became the center of this struggle. It was not enough to capture it. You had to hold it, feed it, and defend the vast network that supported it. Both sides learned this the hard way. As the war continued, the suffering of the population grew unbearable. Armies on both sides took what they needed, often leaving nothing behind. Famine spread. Disease followed. Even the wealthiest families were reduced to desperation. In such conditions, loyalty to any ruler became secondary to survival. The dream of a stable, shared society faded with each passing year. Yet even in this chaos, there were moments when Theodoric's vision flickered back to life. One of the most striking examples came under Totila, a later Gothic king. Unlike many of his predecessors, he understood that victory required more than force. He reached out to the Roman population, reminding them of the relative peace they had once known. He spoke of a shared future where Goths and Italians could rebuild together. When he captured Rome, he chose not to destroy it. Instead, he repaired its walls, restored its life, and even held public games to revive its spirit. Totila's actions showed that the idea of cooperation had not completely died. But the world around him had changed too much. The long war had weakened the kingdom beyond repair. Resources were gone, populations were devastated, and trust had been broken too many times. In the end, the Ostrogothic kingdom did not fall simply because it was defeated in battle. It fell because the balance it depended on could no longer be maintained. Theodoric had held two worlds together through strength, vision, and control. Without him, those worlds slowly drifted apart, pulled by the pressures of war, ambition, and survival. The emperor first turned to an old and experienced man, Liberius. By this time, he was already a figure from another age, one of the last great survivors of the world that had linked Odovacar, Theodoric, and the Roman Empire. He had helped organize the settlements of barbarian peoples in Italy, served at the highest levels of government, and later continued his career in the East under Justinian. Even in old age, when most men had long withdrawn from public life, he was still being called back into service. Justinian repeatedly considered him for command against the Goths, but each time delay and hesitation weakened the effort before it could begin. When a Gothic attack threatened Sicily, Liberius was finally given a fleet. Though judged too old for the task and soon recalled, he still managed to enter Syracuse and attempt to break the siege before withdrawing. That brief action captured something essential about him. He was elderly, perhaps even out of place in a younger generation's war, but he had not lost the instinct to act. His later career was just as restless. Even after returning to Constantinople, he was sent west again, this time to Spain, where he became involved in the internal struggles of the Visigoths. His mission there achieved little, but his life itself remains remarkable. He lived long enough to witness the official reorganization of reconquered Italy and played an important role in setting its administration in motion. He died at an extraordinary age, almost a living bridge between the late Roman and post-Roman worlds. In many ways, Liberius symbolized the persistence of Roman governmental tradition. Even after the political order that had once supported, it was already vanishing. After Liberius, Justinian looked to another possibility, his own nephew Germanus. This choice reveals how seriously the emperor had begun to treat the war. Germanus was not simply another officer. Through his marriage to Matasuensa, granddaughter of Theodoric, he represented a possible political solution as much as a military one. In him, Roman imperial legitimacy and Gothic dynastic blood were joined. For some observers, especially those still dreaming of reconciliation, this seemed to open a final possibility. Perhaps Goths and Romans might yet live together in a single political order, not in tension, but in harmony. Perhaps the long and bloody conflict could end not with extermination, but with synthesis. Germanus began preparing in earnest, and for the first time the Byzantine war effort seemed to gain the overwhelming strength it had long lacked. More troops were assembled. Control of the Adriatic improved. Progress was made south of Ravenna, but before this promise could be tested in battle, Germanus died. His death ended more than a military plan. It extinguished one of the last credible hopes for a negotiated or symbolic union between the Gothic and Roman worlds. Some still looked to the unborn child he left behind as a faint possibility, imagining that perhaps new blood might heal old divisions. But this was only a dream, and a fragile one. History moved in another direction. The command then passed to Narses, a man utterly unlike the warrior kings and barbarian nobles against whom he now marched. He was a eunuch, a palace official, a servant of the imperial court, rather than a frontier commander shaped by generations of violence. Yet he was also disciplined, intelligent, and efficient. When he entered Italy, he did so not as a politician hesitating between diplomacy and war, but as a commander determined to finish the struggle. He understood clearly that delay favoured the Goths. Italy was exhausted. The countryside had been stripped bare by decades of siege, requisition, and hunger. A slow war would punish both sides, and perhaps undo imperial gains. Narses wanted a decision. Totila understood the situation just as well. He knew that if the full Byzantine strength gathered and advanced together, the Goths would be crushed. His only hope was to strike before that concentration was complete. For years he'd shown remarkable skill, patience, and political intelligence. He had preserved Gothic resistance after the kingdom seemed already ruined. He had reached out to the Roman population. He had restored parts of Rome rather than destroying it. He had tried to persuade Italians that the Gothic cause and the Italian cause were one and the same. But now he faced a final test. The armies met at Bustagalorum. Before the battle began, Totila tried to buy time while waiting for reinforcements from nearby camps. Then came one of the most memorable scenes in the whole war. According to the account, he mounted his magnificent horse, dressed in splendid armour, and rode between the two armies, performing an extraordinary display of skill. He wheeled his horse, shifted direction with ease, tossed his spear into the air, and caught it again, moved with elegance and confidence, leaning from side to side, showing complete mastery over horse and weapon. It was part challenge, part performance, part ritual. More than anything, it was a declaration of identity. In that moment, Totila was not simply a king or commander. He was a Gothic war leader before his people, embodying martial pride, courage, and tradition. That scene matters because it captures the complexity of Totila. He had spoken the language of coexistence. He had tried to preserve the partnership between Goths and Romans. He appreciated the Roman world far more than a simple barbarian stereotype would suggest. Yet beneath all that, he remained unmistakably Gothic. He had not become Roman. The old warrior ethos still lived in him, just as it had in Theodoric, even when both men worked through Roman institutions and governed Roman cities. Totila's battlefield display was not merely vanity. It was a final appeal to the spirit of his followers. But courage and style could not overcome the strategic reality. Narses had arranged his forces well. The Byzantine army fought with discipline and flexibility. Gothic cavalry attacked hard, as expected, using spears and direct assault, but they were driven back against their own infantry. Outnumbered and increasingly trapped, the Gothic line gave way under pressure. Totila cast off his royal splendour and died fighting among ordinary soldiers, no longer separated from them by gold or ceremony. He fell as a warrior, which was perhaps the only death his followers could truly respect. Thousands died with him, including many of the Roman deserters who had joined the Gothic cause. His death was not just the loss of a king. It marked the end of the last truly dynamic effort to preserve the Ostrogothic kingdom as a living political force. After Totila, the Gothic nobility once again chose a new king, Theas. This in itself is revealing. The monarchy still existed, but now it clearly depended on noble selection rather than dynastic stability. Theas ruled only briefly, but even in his short reign there were echoes of the old kingdom's ideals. His coinage circulated widely and still invoked the memory of better times, especially the age when Theodoric and Emperor Anastasius had maintained peace and order between Gothic independence and Roman unity. Even in these final days, symbols mattered. They show that the Goths did not see themselves merely as desperate rebels. They still imagined their rule as legitimate, civilized, and connected to an older political balance. Theas made his final stand at Mons Lactarius. There too the fighting was fierce, but the outcome no longer hung in the balance. The Gothic cause had already been broken. After his death, many of the Goths who had fought with him were allowed to go home in peace. Others continued for a while. A force under Ragnaris, himself not even Gothic by blood, but of Hunnic descent, held out at Campsus. Another commander, Aligernus, allied with Narses in order to defend northern Italy from the Franks, who had once been Gothic partners, and were now simply another danger descending on a shattered land. These details matter because they show how mixed and fluid the Gothic world had become by the end. Leadership, alliance, and identity were no longer simple. By 554, the kingdom was effectively gone, though a few garrisons in the north continued to resist for years. Even these eventually surrendered. The political structure built by Theodoric had vanished, but the people did not vanish with it. Most Ostrogoths simply remained in Italy. They did not march away as a nation into exile. They returned to homes, estates, villages, and towns. They married, farmed, worshipped, traded, and gradually disappeared into the wider Italian population. Their political independence ended, but their social absorption continued quietly. This quiet merging is one of the most important parts of the story. The Ostrogoths had not been a passing army camping in Italy for a few years. They had settled deeply enough that defeat in war did not mean physical disappearance. Over time, they became harder and harder to distinguish from the people among whom they lived. Some still claimed to follow Gothic law generations later, but these were remnants, isolated survivals of an older identity. As a people in the political sense, the Goths were finished. As human beings, they lived on by becoming part of Italy itself. That is why the fall of the Ostrogothic kingdom is more tragic and more interesting than a simple tale of conquest. It was not just the defeat of one army by another, it was the destruction of a political experiment that had once seemed to offer something different from either complete imperial restoration or complete barbarian separation. Theodoric had tried to create a kingdom in which Goths and Romans would remain distinct but cooperate within a single state. His successors were too weak or too divided to sustain that vision. The long war with Justinian destroyed the practical foundations on which it stood. Yet the dream itself never wholly disappeared. It survived in figures like Totila, in the symbolic marriage of Germanus and Matasuentha, in the coinage, in the continued attempts to speak of Goths and Italians as sharing one cause. The end came anyway, but what followed was not emptiness. The Ostrogoths helped shape the Italy they entered and the Italy they left behind. They contributed to administration, warfare, religion, aristocratic culture, and social change. Their greatest leaders, above all Theodoric and Totila, were not minor barbarian warlords, standing outside civilization. They were central figures in the transformation of the late ancient world. Theodoric, in particular, deserves to be remembered as one of the most capable Germanic rulers of the age. He supported education, preserved Roman institutions, encouraged scholarship, tolerated religious difference, and gave Italy decades of peace after generations of disorder. Men like Cassiodorus, Boethius, and Dionysius Exiguus flourished in the world he made possible. The Church, too, benefited from the breathing space his stability created. At the same time, the Ostrogoths influenced art, military culture, political organization, and the wider exchange between Italy and the barbarian world beyond the Alps. Their workshops produced objects admired across Europe. Their frontier systems helped secure trade and communication. Their presence mattered far beyond the boundaries of their settlements,